Hi, this is Professor William Wagner, and we're broadcasting live from Spring Arbor University. We're here today to talk about for faith and for freedom. It is Religious Freedom Day. It is also Martin Luther King Day. In January 16, 1993, that was the first Religious Freedom Day. It was promulgated into law by Congress in October of 1992. It celebrates the anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's Virginia statute for religious freedom. This year, the president commemorated the Religious Freedom Day and indicated that it is important now as it's ever been. He indicated the rise in anti-Semitism and how we must address that. He also addressed the attacks on Christians and other people of other faiths throughout the world as they are exponentially increasing. And so people that believe and understand the importance of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion must stand. And the president was making that point. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed Martin Luther King Day into law as a federal holiday that honors, obviously, the birthday of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We don't hear too often anymore his title of Reverend as a pastor, but we want to make that point here today, especially, as we look at how these two dates interface with each other and why faith was so important to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in his endeavors as he led a civil rights movement. Contrary to much of what we see today on the streets, the Reverend King always spoke for nonviolent activism in his leadership of a civil rights movement where people, all made in the very image of God, would be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. The Reverend Martin Luther King was a civil rights leader that always used his God-given right to religious freedom as a basis and a catalyst for the movement, where he was able to express these eternal truths and to do it in such a way that a nation's heart was changed. And it matters. The worldview through which you see the world matters. And the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King understood that. He understood that this overarching story or meta-narrative that answers the basic questions of life and meaning and what is right and wrong and what is moral and not. Questions like, what is a human being? What is right and wrong? Why are we here? What's our ultimate purpose? How should we live? These were questions that were answered through the lens of the Holy Bible. And when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King led the civil rights movement to the place that he did, he recognized that lens was our founders' lens, and the Declaration and the Constitution answers these hard questions in the following way: that a human being is created in the very image of a good and loving creator, and that our primary identity comes from our relationship with him, because we're all made in the image of God. We are all equally worthy of being treated with dignity and respect. And so that worldview that King saw the world through, that worldview that our founders understood as expressed in the Declaration and in the 14th Amendment, and in that Virginia statute on religion. All these laws contained founding principles that were moral absolutes. They are self-evident truths that correspond to reality, and they remain constant throughout time. So we have a measure to measure right and wrong against, good and bad against, and just and unjust against. These are principles that are reliable, objective standards to measure whether government action is good or bad, just or unjust, constitutional or unconstitutional. The Declaration of Independence clearly reflects such a view. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And the Reverend Martin Luther King set that standard up front and said and showed where the American nation wasn't following it, and took us to a place where we could look to see right and wrong, good and bad, just and unjust. We see that promise of the Declaration embodied in the structure and text of the American Constitution. The document's framers there, they made clear that we the people delegate power to the government with which to secure our freedom, while expressly limiting government's exercise of power in ways that deprive citizens of their inalienable life and liberty interests, including equal protection of the laws. And that is what the Reverend Martin Luther King shined a light on and made so clear. These unalienable life and liberty interests, they limit the exercise of government power. And, that is a function that provides freedom of thought and conscience and liberty, and says to government, you must let the citizens of this nation express their conscience, express their thoughts, and exercise their religion. And that's a very, very different kind of government than those, some of whom are wrongly using the Reverend Martin Luther King's names to portray and to say that there is, ought to be a different kind of government. And the Reverend Martin Luther King promoted equality as equal rights. He said we should strive to be colorblind, focused on the content of one's character rather than the color of their skin. Others are out there today saying we should be blind to everything but color. They're actually condemning equality and color blindness. I've seen people call it microaggressions and even called racism if you stand for the principles that the Reverend Martin Luther King stood for. Now, some of these organizations and some of these people have been, involved in violent riots on the streets, contrary to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's non-violent resistance. You can go to the websites, at different times of some of these folks that are saying that we ought to go to more of a Marxist type of government, and said, they said things such as, the Western prescribed nuclear family structure must be destroyed. That's a central tenet of Marxism. And Dr. King promoted, on the other hand, the family as the foundational to society. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King had objections to that kind of Marxist government. He in his book, he said, first, I rejected their materialist interpretation of history. He went on to say, communism, avowedly secularist and materialist, has no place for God. This I could never accept, for as a Christian, I believe that there is a creative personal power in the universe who is in the ground and essence of all reality, a power that cannot be explained in materialistic terms. History is ultimately guided by spirit and not matter. Since for the communists, there is no divine government, no absolute moral order, there are no fixed immutable principles. Consequently, almost anything, force, violence, murder, lying, is a justifiable means to the millennial end. This type of relativism was abhorrent to me, he says. Constructive ends can never give absolute moral justification to destructive means, because in the final analysis, he says, in the end it is pre-existence in the means. Now, he thirdly opposed communism as a political totalitarianism. He said in communism, the individual ends up in subjection to the state. True, Marxists would argue that the state is an interim reality, which is to be eliminated when the classless society emerges, he says. But then he notes, but the state is the end while it lasts, and man is only a means to that end. And if man's so-called rights and liberties stand in the way of that end, they are simply swept aside. His liberties of expression, his freedom to vote, his freedom to listen to what news he likes or chooses, which books they're all restricted, he said. Man becomes hardly more in communism than a depersonalized cog in the turning wheel of the state. He made very clear that the depreciation of the individual was very objectionable, to him. He said, "I am convinced now, as I was then, that a man is an end because he is a child of God. Man is not made for the state is made for man," he said. "To deprive a man of freedom is to relegate him to the status of a thing rather than to elevate him to the status of a person. Man must never be treated as a means to the end of the state," he said, but always as an end within itself. Again, that's because he saw, using his Christian worldview lens, that all human beings were made in the very image of God, and therefore everyone was worthy of being treated with dignity by the government. And today we have folks with a lot of secular dogma out there wanting to get rid of anybody's ability to engage in freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, instead of looking to the faith that so grounded and so influenced the Reverend Martin Luther King. They want to remove it from the marketplace of ideas. And so today, as we celebrate Religious Freedom Day, and as we celebrate the life of the Reverend Martin Luther King, let us remember that freedom of thought, conscience, and religion isn't something that just automatically happens. It's something that we in each generation need to stand for, speak for peacefully, as Martin did, and unafraid as he did as well. And so until next time, this is Professor William Wagner for Faith and Freedom. God bless all of you.